The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered boards of Millfield's only stable as Thomas Blackwood bent over a water trough, his gray hair catching the early light. His hands, gnarled from decades of work, moved with gentle precision as he checked the wooden bucket for splinters that might cut a horse's muzzle. At 71, Thomas had the stooped shoulders of a man who had spent his life looking down at tasks others considered beneath notice. The horses knew his step before he entered their stalls. Buttercup, a golden mare with white stockings, nickered softly as Thomas approached with her morning oats. He ran his weathered palm along her neck, feeling for any heat that might signal injury or illness. This was his world now, these dozen horses belonging to the Hartwell Ranch, and the simple rhythm of feeding, grooming, and mucking stalls that filled his days from dawn until dusk. Thomas had worked at this stable for 8 years, ever since he had wandered into Millfield with nothing but the clothes on his back, and a strange way with horses that even the most spirited animals seemed to respect. The townspeople knew little about his past, and Thomas preferred it that way. He was simply the stable hand, the old man who talked to horses in whispers and somehow kept them calmer than any younger man had ever managed. The thunder of hoofbeats on the main road made Buttercup's ears prick forward. Thomas straightened slowly, his back protesting the movement, and walked to the stable's wide doorway. 5 riders approached at a gallop, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces hard beneath the brims of their dusty hats. The leader, a thick-set man with cruel eyes and a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, pulled his mount to a sharp stop just outside the stable. Colt Brennan had a reputation that stretched across 3 territories: horse thief, cattle rustler, and killer. He rode with 4 men who shared his taste for easy money and violent solutions. Today, his pale eyes surveyed the stable with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up prey. "Good morning, gentlemen," Thomas said, stepping forward with the deference of a servant greeting his betters. His voice carried the soft cadence of a man who had learned that quiet words caused less trouble than loud ones. "Might I help you with something?" Brennan dismounted and handed his reins to one of his men without looking away from the horses visible in their stalls. "We heard tell this stable houses some fine bloodstock, old man. Thought we might take a look at what Hartwell's got penned up here." Thomas nodded respectfully, though something flickered behind his pale blue eyes. "Mr. Hartwell's horses are some of the finest in the territory, that's true enough. But they're not for sale, I'm afraid. He treats them like family, he does." One of Brennan's men, a weaselly youth named Pike, snorted with laughter. "Family, he says. Hear that, boss? The old fool thinks horses got feelings." Brennan stepped closer to Thomas, using his superior height and bulk to loom over the older man. "I wasn't asking if they were for sale, grandfather. I was telling you I wanted a look. You got a problem with that?" The stable hand took a small step backward, his shoulders hunching further as if trying to make himself smaller. "No problem at all, sir. Just thought you should know they belong to Mr. Hartwell, that's all. Wouldn't want there to be any confusion." The gang spread out through the stable, examining each horse with the practiced eye of men who knew valuable horseflesh when they saw it. Brennan paused before Thunder, a magnificent black stallion with intelligent eyes and perfect conformation. The horse snorted and backed away from the stranger's approach, but when Thomas made a soft clicking sound with his tongue, Thunder immediately calmed. "How'd you do that?" Brennan demanded. Thomas shrugged, the gesture making him appear even more frail. "Horses can sense a person's intentions, sir. They know when someone means them harm and when someone's trying to help. I've been working with them for a long time. You learn to speak their language, you might say." Pike laughed again, louder this time. "Their language. You hear this old coot, boys. Thinks he's some kind of horse whisperer or something." Brennan's scarred face twisted into a grin that held no warmth. "Well, horse whisperer, let me tell you something. We'll be back tonight when the moon's dark. And when we come, you'd best be nowhere to be found. These horses are coming with us, and anybody who tries to stop us is going to find themselves breathing dirt. You understand me, old man?" Thomas nodded quickly, his hands trembling slightly as he twisted his worn hat. "I understand, sir. I surely do. But I hope you'll reconsider. These horses, they're not easy to handle. They've got particular ways about them." The gang leader grabbed Thomas by the front of his shirt, lifting the smaller man almost off his feet. "Are you threatening me, you ancient piece of garbage?" No, sir, Thomas gasped, his voice higher now with apparent fear. Just trying to be helpful, that's all. Wouldn't want you to get hurt trying to handle animals you don't know. Brennan released him with enough force to send Thomas stumbling backward into a wooden post. The old man winced and rubbed his shoulder where it had struck the timber. You just make sure you're not here tonight, grandfather. Because if I see your face when we come calling, I'll put a bullet in it. As the 5 men mounted their horses and rode away, Thomas remained slumped against the post, watching them disappear down the dusty road. Only when they were completely out of sight did he straighten his shoulders and walk slowly back to Thunder's stall. The stallion whickered softly and nuzzled Thomas's shoulder where Brennan had grabbed him. I know, boy, Thomas murmured, stroking the horse's neck with steady hands that no longer trembled. They think they know what they're doing. But 30 years in the cavalry teaches a man a thing or two about protecting valuable horses from thieves. Thunder stamped his foot once, as if in agreement, while Thomas's pale blue eyes grew cold as winter steel. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Colt Brennan and his men returned to Millfield, this time approaching the stable from the ridge overlooking the town. They dismounted behind a cluster of pine trees and took turns studying the layout through a battered brass spyglass that Pike had stolen from a surveyor 2 months earlier. Brennan watched as Thomas moved between the stalls with an efficiency that seemed almost supernatural. The old man appeared to anticipate each horse's needs before the animal could express them. When the chestnut gelding named Copper began to pace restlessly in his stall, Thomas was there with a handful of sweet oats before the horse had taken 3 steps. When the gray mare Stella started favoring her left front hoof, Thomas examined it and removed a small stone wedge between her shoe and frog with movements so gentle the mare never flinched. That old fool knows those horses better than most men know their own wives, muttered Jake Drummond, Brennan's second in command. Been watching him for an hour now, and he ain't made a single wasted motion. Brennan lowered the spyglass and spat into the dust. Don't matter how well he knows them if he's dead. And dead he'll be if he gets in our way tonight. Pike shifted nervously beside them. Boss, you see how that black stallion calmed down the second the old man made that clicking sound. Never seen nothing like it. Most horses take weeks to learn commands like that. Through the spyglass, they watched Thomas approach Thunder with a rope halter. Instead of struggling or shying away as most horses would when fitted with unfamiliar tack, Thunder lowered his head and stood perfectly still while Thomas slipped the halter into place. The old stable hand ran his hands along the stallion's legs, checking for heat or swelling with the systematic thoroughness of a man who had performed this examination thousands of times. Brennan's eyes narrowed as he watched Thomas's inspection technique. The old man's hands moved with practiced precision, feeling along tendons and joints in a pattern that spoke of extensive training. This wasn't the fumbling touch of a simple stable hand. This was the methodical examination of someone who understood equine anatomy at a professional level. When Thomas finished his inspection, he led Thunder out to the paddock for exercise. Instead of simply turning the horse loose, Thomas guided Thunder through a series of movements that looked almost like a dance. The stallion responded to subtle pressures from Thomas's hands and barely perceptible shifts in his body position, turning left and right, backing up, and even rearing slightly on command. How in blazes does a stable hand know cavalry training exercises? Drummond whispered. Brennan's scarred face darkened with suspicion. He grabbed the spyglass back from Pike and focused on Thomas's movements. The old man was putting Thunder through maneuvers that Brennan had seen only once before, when he had briefly served with a Union cavalry unit before deserting with stolen horses and equipment. These weren't the casual exercises of a civilian horseman. These were military drills designed to prepare cavalry mounts for battle conditions. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made the gang duck lower behind their cover. A young woman rode into the stable yard on a spirited bay mare, dismounting with the fluid grace of someone who had been riding since childhood. Sarah Hartwell was 23 years old, with auburn hair twisted into a practical braid and the sun-weathered complexion of someone who spent her days outdoors managing her late father's ranch. "Good afternoon, Thomas," she called as she led her mare toward the stable. "How are the horses today?" Thomas smiled genuinely for the first time since morning, his weathered face creasing with obvious affection. "They're all fine, Miss Sarah. Thunder's been frisky today, so I gave him some extra exercise. That gray mare Stella had a stone in her hoof, but I got it out clean. Sarah nodded approvingly as she began unsaddling her mare. You have such a way with them, Thomas. Father always said you understood horses better than anyone he'd ever met. These animals represent 4 generations of careful breeding. They're not just valuable, they're irreplaceable. Thomas's expression grew serious as he helped Sarah carry her saddle to the tack room. Speaking of that, Miss Sarah, I should mention we had some visitors earlier. 5 men, rough-looking types, asking questions about your father's horses. Sarah's hands stilled on the saddle blanket. What kind of questions? The kind that make an old horseman nervous, Thomas replied carefully. Their leader, fellow with a scar on his face, made it clear they'd be back tonight. Said they intended to take the horses with them. The color drained from Sarah's face. Horse thieves. Thomas, you have to get word to Sheriff Morrison immediately. These horses are all I have left of Father's legacy. Thomas placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Miss Sarah, you don't worry about those men. Your father's horses will be here tomorrow morning, and every morning after that. I give you my word. There was something in his tone, a quiet certainty that seemed out of place coming from a humble stable hand. Sarah looked into Thomas's pale blue eyes and saw something there that she had never noticed before. It was the steady gaze of a man who had made promises before and kept them, regardless of the cost. But Thomas, there are 5 of them, and Sarah stopped herself before finishing the sentence. I'm old, Thomas said with a slight smile. Yes, Miss Sarah, I surely am. But being old doesn't mean being helpless. These horses have been in my care for 8 years, and no harm has come to them yet. After Sarah rode back to the ranch house to alert the sheriff, Thomas returned to his work with renewed purpose. But his tasks now took on a different character. He checked each stall door's latch mechanism, examining the iron fittings with the scrutiny of a man evaluating defensive positions. He walked the perimeter of the paddock, noting sight lines and approach routes with the methodical assessment of someone trained in tactical planning. When Brennan and his men emerged from their hiding place to conduct a closer reconnaissance, they found Thomas mucking out stalls with his usual quiet efficiency. Brennan dismounted and approached the stable, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. Afternoon again, old-timer, Brennan said with false friendliness. Hope you've been thinking about our conversation from this morning. Thomas straightened slowly, leaning on his pitchfork like a man whose back pained him. I've been thinking about it, yes, sir. Thinking real hard. And what conclusions did you reach, grandfather? Thomas met Brennan's stare without flinching. I reached the conclusion that these horses know things most horses don't. They won't go quietly with strangers, and they won't stay quiet if they're mistreated. Horses remember everything, Mr. Brennan. Everything. Brennan's eyes narrowed. How do you know my name, old man? Thomas shrugged. Word travels in a small town. Folks talk about strangers, especially ones with reputations. Pike laughed nervously. What kind of reputation we got, Grandpa? The kind that follows men who take things that don't belong to them, Thomas replied calmly. The kind that makes honest folks lock their doors and hide their valuables. Brennan stepped closer, his hand tightening on his gun grip. You got a smart mouth for a man in your position. Maybe I should teach you some manners right now. Thomas didn't retreat this time. Instead, he shifted his grip on the pitchfork, and something in his posture changed subtly. He no longer looked like a frightened old man. He looked like someone who had faced down threats before and survived them all. You're welcome to try, Thomas said quietly. But I should warn you, those horses you're planning to steal tonight, they won't go easy. I trained them myself, and they know the difference between friend and foe. Train them for what? Drummond demanded. Thomas smiled, and the expression was cold as a January wind. For exactly the situation you boys are planning to create. Before leaving, let me ask you something. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Drop a comment and let me know what country you're in. These stories of loyalty and protection seem to travel far and wide, and it amazes me how they connect with people everywhere. Now, stay with me because what Thomas has prepared for these horse thieves tonight will surprise you more than you can imagine. As evening approached and the thieves rode away to prepare for their midnight raid, Thomas continued his work with the careful precision of a craftsman preparing his masterpiece. He checked each rope and halter, examined every latch and gate, and whispered soft instructions to horses that seemed to understand every word he spoke. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky the color of fresh blood. Midnight arrived with a moonless sky that should have provided perfect cover for horse thieves. Colt Brennan led his men down the ridge toward Millfield's stable, their horses' hooves muffled by strips of cloth they had tied around each shoe. The darkness was so complete that they had to rely on memory and the faint outline of buildings against the star-filled sky to navigate the final approach. "Everything's quiet," Pike whispered as they dismounted 50 yards from the stable. "Old man probably ran off soon as the sun set." Brennan studied the building through the darkness. No lamplight showed through any windows, and no sound came from within the structure. Perfect. The horses should be deep in sleep, making them easy to halter and lead away without resistance. He had pulled this same job dozens of times across 3 territories, and it always followed the same pattern. Sleeping horses were docile horses, and docile horses meant easy money. Jake Drummond moved to the stable's main door and found it unlatched, just as they had left it during their afternoon scouting. The hinges had been oiled recently and made no sound as the door swung open on the darkness within. Brennan smiled with satisfaction. The old fool really had run off, leaving everything undefended. But as soon as they stepped inside, something felt wrong. Instead of the deep, rhythmic breathing of sleeping horses, they heard shuffling, snorting, and the sound of hooves moving restlessly in straw. Every horse in the stable was awake and agitated, their heads raised and ears pinned back as if they sensed approaching danger. "What's got them all stirred up?" muttered Ned Cooper, the youngest member of Brennan's gang. "They should be sleeping like babies." Brennan struck a match and held it high, casting flickering shadows across the interior of the stable. 12 pairs of eyes reflected the flames light back at them, and every horse was standing alert in their stalls. Thunder, the magnificent black stallion, pawed the ground and snorted with obvious agitation. "Don't matter if they're awake," Brennan said, though uncertainty crept into his voice. "Awake horses are still just horses. Pike, get those halters on them. We'll be out of here in 10 minutes." Pike approached Thunder's stall with a rope halter, but as soon as he reached for the latch, he stopped short. Instead of the simple leather strap he expected to find, the stall door was secured with an intricate knot that seemed to twist and loop back on itself in ways that defied quick understanding. "Boss," Pike called softly, "come look at this." Brennan brought his match closer and examined the knot that held Thunder's stall closed. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, woven through the latch mechanism with mathematical precision. He tried to follow the rope's path with his eyes, but every attempt to identify the starting point only led him deeper into the maze of loops and twists. "Just cut the rope," Brennan ordered, but when Pike drew his knife and began sawing at the thick hemp, he discovered that cutting one strand only seemed to tighten the others. Drummond had moved to the next stall, where Copper the chestnut gelding waited with the same alert tension as Thunder. The same type of complex knot secured this door, and the next, and the next. Every stall in the stable was locked with identical rope puzzles that seemed designed specifically to frustrate anyone who tried to solve them quickly. "What kind of knots are these?" Cooper whispered, his voice tight with growing anxiety. "The kind that take 30 years of experience to tie properly," came a calm voice from the shadows near the far end of the stable. Thomas Blackwood stepped into the circle of match light, but the man who emerged bore little resemblance to the frightened old stable hand who had cowered before them earlier in the day. Gone was the stooped posture and trembling hands. Thomas stood straight and tall, his pale blue eyes steady and cold as winter ice. His movements carried the fluid confidence of a man who knew exactly where he was and what he intended to do. Brennan's hand dropped to his gun butt. "I thought you'd have run off by now, old man." Thomas smiled without warmth. "Run from what?" "A handful of amateurs who think stealing horses is as simple as opening a gate and leading them away. You boys have a lot to learn about the profession you've chosen." Pike continued sawing frantically at the rope securing Thunder's stall, but with each strand he cut, the knot seemed to reconfigure itself, becoming tighter rather than looser. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool night air. "These knots ain't natural," Pike gasped. "Every time I cut one piece, 2 more appear." Thomas watched Pike's futile efforts with professional interest. "Those are cavalry anti-theft knots, son, developed during the war between the states to prevent Confederate raiders from stealing Union horses. I should know because I'm the man who designed them." The match burned down to Brennan's fingers, and he dropped it with a curse. In the sudden darkness, they heard Thomas's voice continue with the same calm confidence. 30 years I spent training horses for the United States Army. Learned every trick that horse thieves tried because it was my job to stay one step ahead of men just like you. Raiders, rustlers, deserters who thought they could make easy money stealing cavalry mounts. I caught them all. Drummond struck another match, and in the brief flare of light, they could see Thomas had moved closer. He no longer carried himself like an elderly stable hand. His bearing was military now, straight-backed and alert, with the controlled tension of a professional soldier. "You're lying," Brennan snarled. "You're just some broken-down old fool who mucks stalls for a living." Thomas reached into his vest and withdrew a small leather folder. When Drummond brought the match closer, they could see the glint of a metal badge inside. The star bore the inscription United States Marshal, and below it, a name that made Pike's knife clatter to the floor. "Thomas Iron Creek," Pike whispered, his face going white in the match light. "Sweet Mary and Joseph, boss, that's Thomas Iron Creek." Drummond's hand began to shake, making the match flame dance wildly. "I heard tell you was dead. Shot down in Kansas 3 years back." "Retired, not dead," Thomas corrected. "Though I can understand the confusion. When a man decides to disappear, he makes sure the disappearance is complete. I've been Thomas Blackwood for 8 years now, and I've enjoyed every day of peace it's brought me." Brennan drew his gun, but his movements lacked their earlier confidence. "So you're the famous horse whisperer, Marshal. Heard you tracked down the Jameson gang and brought them in alive after they stole a whole cavalry remuda." "Among others," Thomas confirmed. 43 horse thieves captured over 3 decades of service. Some came quietly. Others required more persuasion. The second match burned out, plunging them back into darkness. When Cooper struck a third one, they found that Thomas had moved again, this time positioning himself between them and the stable's main door. In the flickering light, they could see he now held an old but well-maintained Colt revolver with the casual familiarity of someone who had carried it for decades. "Now then," Thomas said in the same conversational tone he had used to discuss the weather, "let me explain your situation. Those knots you can't untie. I designed them specifically to prevent exactly what you're attempting tonight. The horses are awake because I trained them to recognize the smell and sound of men with criminal intent. And every exit from this stable leads exactly where I want it to lead." Brennan raised his gun, but Thomas's voice stopped him before he could aim. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, son. You see, I sent word to Sheriff Morrison hours ago. He should be arriving with a full posse right about now. Your choice is simple. Surrender peacefully, or try to fight your way out against a man who's forgotten more about tactics than you'll ever learn." Pike looked frantically around the stable, searching for an escape route that Thomas hadn't anticipated. But every shadow seemed to hide potential threats, and every sound from outside could be approaching lawmen. "You're bluffing," Brennan said, but uncertainty made his voice crack. "You're just one old man." Thomas's smile was visible even in the dim match light. "One old man who spent 3 decades hunting men exactly like you. One old man who knows this stable better than you know your own names. One old man who wrote the manual on catching horse thieves that every marshal from here to California still uses today." The match died, and in the darkness that followed, Thomas's voice carried with absolute authority. "You boys picked the wrong stable tonight. But more than that, you picked the wrong profession entirely. Horse stealing is a young man's game, and it requires skills none of you possess. I should know. I've been putting men like you behind bars since before some of you were born." Outside, the sound of approaching horses confirmed Thomas's words. Sheriff Morrison's voice called through the night air, demanding surrender from anyone inside the stable. Thomas Iron Creek's laugh was soft, but carried clearly through the darkness. "Like I said, boys, you should have chosen a different line of work." Thomas struck his own match, and in the steady flame they could see his face clearly for the first time since their confrontation began. Gone completely was any trace of the humble stable hand who had served them coffee and spoken in deferential whispers. The man before them carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had commanded respect across 3 territories and earned a reputation that outlasted his active service. "Let me show you boys exactly what you walked into tonight," Thomas said calmly. He moved to a wooden lever mounted on the stable wall that none of them had noticed in their earlier scouting. When he pulled it down, a A series of mechanical clicks echoed through the building, followed by the solid thunk of heavy bars dropping into place. Brennan spun toward the main door and found his escape route blocked by a thick wooden beam that had descended from the ceiling to bar their exit. Every window showed similar barriers, and even the small side door they had planned to use for loading horses was now sealed shut. What in hell? Drummond gasped, trying to lift the beam that blocked the main door. The wooden barrier was far too heavy for one man to move, and it was anchored into iron brackets built directly into the stable's frame. Thomas watched their growing panic with professional detachment. I designed this stable's security system myself, gentlemen. 8 years I've had to perfect it, and you're the first men foolish enough to test it. Every entrance can be sealed simultaneously with the pull of a single lever. Every exit leads exactly where I want it to lead, and tonight that destination is nowhere. Pike continued his futile struggle with the anti-theft knots, but sweat now poured down his face as he realized the futility of his efforts. Boss, these ropes ain't giving up nothing. It's like they're alive or something. Thomas moved to Thunder's stall, and with a series of quick, practiced movements, untied the complex knot in less than 10 seconds. The rope fell away as if it had never been secured at all. The black stallion immediately calmed and nuzzled Thomas's shoulder with obvious affection. 30 years of experience teaches a man the difference between a knot that's meant to keep horses in and a knot that's meant to keep thieves out, Thomas explained as he retied the rope with the same lightning speed. The horses know these knots don't hurt them, but strangers trying to steal them find the ropes tighten with every attempt to cut them loose. You're some kind of devil, Cooper whispered, his voice shaking with superstitious dread. Thomas shook his head. Just a man who learned his trade thoroughly and practiced it honestly. You want to know about devils? Let me tell you about the Jameson brothers. Now those boys were devils. Stole 300 cavalry horses during the war and thought they were untouchable. He began moving through the stable with the fluid confidence of someone who knew every board and nail in the building. As he walked, Thomas continued his story with the casual tone of a man discussing the weather. Tracked the Jamesons across 5 states and 2 territories. Took me 8 months, but I learned every trick they knew and invented a few they'd never seen. By the time I caught up with them, they'd stolen so many horses they needed a dozen men just to manage the herd. Brennan kept his gun trained on Thomas, but the old marshal seemed completely unconcerned about the weapon pointed at his chest. Instead, he approached a section of the stable wall that looked identical to every other section. When he pressed against a specific board, a hidden panel swung open to reveal a collection of items that made Pike's breath catch in his throat. The concealed compartment contained an arsenal of weapons, badges, wanted posters, and official documents that spoke to a career spanning decades of law enforcement. Thomas withdrew a rifle with the same casual motion he might use to pick up a pitchfork, checking its action with the automatic precision of a man who had performed this inspection thousands of times. Winchester Model 1873, Thomas said, noting their stares. Custom modified for long-range work. Used this rifle to capture the Morrison gang when they tried to steal horses from Fort Riley. Shot the hat clean off their leader's head from 400 yards. Convinced them to surrender without bloodshed. He returned the rifle to its place and withdrew a thick folder filled with official correspondence. Letters from generals, commendations from territorial governors, and testimonials from fellow marshals created a documentary record of a career that had become legend throughout the Western Territories. General Sherman himself wrote this letter, Thomas said, holding up a document with an official military seal. Thanked me personally for developing the training protocols that reduced cavalry horse theft by 78% during the final 2 years of the war. Said my methods saved more horses than any other single innovation in military history. Drummond's match burned down to his fingers, but this time he didn't immediately light another one. The darkness seemed less threatening now than the calm certainty in Thomas's voice as he recounted accomplishments that none of them had imagined possible. When the next match flared, they could see Thomas examining a collection of photographs that showed him with various military and civilian officials. In every picture, he wore the uniform and bearing of a man who commanded respect and wielded authority that stretched across vast distances. This one's my favorite, Thomas said, holding up a photograph that showed him shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit. That's Governor Wallace of New Mexico Territory. He hired me personally to track down the Hernandez gang after they stole his prized breeding stock. Took me 3 weeks to corner them, but I brought back every horse and arrested every gang member without firing a single shot. How? Pike asked despite himself. Superior knowledge of horse behavior and criminal psychology, Thomas replied matter-of-factly. The Hernandez brothers thought they understood horses because they'd grown up around them. But understanding horses and understanding stolen horses are entirely different skills. Stolen horses want to go home. Use that instinct properly, and the horses themselves will lead you right to the thieves. He moved to another section of the wall and triggered a second hidden mechanism. This panel opened to reveal detailed maps of the surrounding territory marked with routes, water sources, and notations in Thomas's careful handwriting. Every escape route within 50 miles of this stable is marked on these maps, Thomas continued. Every water source, every hideout, every place a man might think to cache stolen horses. I've spent 8 years walking every trail, exploring every canyon, and memorizing every landmark. You boys couldn't disappear in this country if you had a week's head start and divine intervention. Brennan's gun hand began to shake slightly. You're lying. No man knows territory that well. Thomas smiled and pointed to a specific notation on one of the maps. Pine Ridge Canyon, 12 miles northeast. Natural corral formed by fallen rocks, good grass, year-round water. The Jameson brothers used it as a staging area for stolen horses. So did the Morrison gang. So did the Hernandez brothers. Every horse thief who's worked this territory in the past 15 years has used that same hiding spot because they all think the same way. He pointed to another mark on the map. Willow Creek Crossing, 8 miles south. Only fordable passage across the creek for 20 miles in either direction. I've arrested 14 different horse thieves at that exact spot because it's the only way to move stolen horses toward the Mexican border. Predictable criminals make easy captures. Cooper struck another match with trembling fingers. The flame revealed that Thomas had moved once again, this time positioning himself near a section of the stable that none of them had explored during their reconnaissance. This is my favorite innovation, Thomas said, placing his hand on what appeared to be an ordinary support post. Took me 2 years to design and another year to build, but it was worth every hour of effort. When he twisted the post, it rotated to reveal a complex system of ropes and pulleys that connected to every stall in the stable. With a series of quick movements, Thomas demonstrated how the entire system could be operated from this single control point. Every stall door, every gate, every barrier in this building can be opened or closed from right here, Thomas explained. I can release the horses one at a time, all at once, or in any combination I choose. More importantly, I can direct them to move in specific patterns that would lead pursuing thieves exactly where I want them to go. To demonstrate, he pulled a specific rope, and Thunder's stall door swung open. The black stallion stepped out calmly and walked directly to Thomas, showing no inclination to flee despite his freedom. 30 years of training creates bonds that don't break easily, Thomas said, stroking Thunder's neck. These horses trust me completely, and that trust makes them partners rather than victims. He pulled another rope, and Thunder's stall door swung closed again. The stallion returned to his stall without prompting, demonstrating a level of training that went far beyond simple obedience. The Comanche taught me that technique, Thomas continued conversationally. During my early years as a territorial marshal, I spent 6 months learning their horse handling methods. They can make horses perform maneuvers that most cavalry officers think are impossible. Applied their techniques to anti-theft training, and the results exceeded every expectation. Brennan was now sweating despite the cool night air. His gun remained pointed at Thomas, but his confidence had evaporated completely. This wasn't the simple robbery he had planned. This was a tactical nightmare where every advantage belonged to their intended victim. Outside, Sheriff Morrison's voice called again, demanding surrender and promising safe passage for anyone who gave up peacefully. The sound of multiple horses and armed men surrounded the stable, eliminating any hope of escape even if they could somehow bypass Thomas's security measures. 43 horse thieves I captured during my active career, Thomas said, returning his attention to the trapped men before him. 43 separate cases, ranging from small-time rustlers to organized gangs that operated across multiple territories. I learned something from every arrest, refined my methods with every case, and improved my systems with every success. He moved to a final hidden compartment and withdrew a thick leather journal filled with detailed notes and sketches. The pages contained technical diagrams, behavioral observations, and tactical analyses that represented decades of accumulated expertise. Case studies, Thomas explained, holding up the journal. Every horse thief I ever caught, every method I ever encountered, every innovation I ever developed. This book contains more knowledge about preventing horse theft than any other document in existence. I wrote it myself, and it's required reading at every cavalry training facility from here to Washington. Pike had given up trying to untie the knots, and was now staring at Thomas with the horrified fascination of a man watching his own execution. Boss, this ain't just some old stable hand. This is the man every horse thief in the territories has nightmares about. Thomas nodded acknowledgement. Reputation has its advantages in this line of work. Half the horse thieves I arrested surrendered the moment they learned who was tracking them. The other half provided valuable learning experiences before their inevitable capture. The match burned out again, and in the darkness that followed, Thomas's voice carried the absolute authority of a man who had never failed at the task he had chosen to pursue. Now then, gentlemen, you have a choice to make, and you need to make it quickly. The choice is surrender peacefully to Sheriff Morrison and his posse, or face the consequences of threatening horses that have been under my protection for 8 years. Thomas continued in the darkness. I should mention that the second option has never ended well for anyone who chose it. Brennan's voice cracked with desperation and rage. You think you're some kind of god, old man, but you're just flesh and blood like the rest of us. One bullet ends this whole show. Thomas struck another match, and in the steady flame his expression remained completely calm. You're welcome to try, son. But before you do, let me explain something about tactical situations and the mistakes men make when fear clouds their judgment. He gestured toward the sealed stable doors and barricaded windows. You're thinking that gun in your hand gives you power in this situation. What you haven't considered is that I've been in this exact position 43 times before, and I've developed very specific methods for dealing with desperate men who think violence is their way out. Pike was now pressed against Thunder's stall, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. Mr. Iron Creek, sir, I never wanted any trouble. This was Brennan's idea from the start. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. I believe you, son. Fear makes men honest, and you're scared enough right now to tell the truth. That honesty might save your life tonight. Brennan swung his gun toward Pike. You yellow-bellied traitor. We stick together or we all hang together. Actually, Thomas interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of a judge pronouncing sentence. Hanging isn't the penalty for horse theft in this territory. It's 5 to 10 years in territorial prison, assuming the horses are recovered unharmed and no one gets killed during the arrest. He reached into his vest and withdrew a small whistle carved from what appeared to be bone. When he blew a single, soft note, every horse in the stable responded immediately. Thunder stepped forward out of his open stall, followed by Copper, Stella, and the rest of the animals. Instead of panicking or scattering, they formed a loose circle around the trapped thieves with the disciplined precision of cavalry mounts responding to battlefield commands. Comanche war whistle, Thomas explained conversationally. Took me 6 months to learn the proper techniques, but the results speak for themselves. These horses will respond to specific whistle commands just as readily as they respond to verbal instructions or physical cues. Drummond stared in horror at the horses surrounding them. They were no longer looking at potential victims. They were facing a coordinated force of animals that moved with the tactical awareness of trained soldiers. Sweet Jesus, they're like an army. Thomas smiled with genuine pride. That's exactly what they are, son. I trained every one of them using techniques developed for cavalry units that faced impossible odds and survived through superior preparation and coordination. These horses have been drilled in anti-theft maneuvers for 8 years. Tonight is their graduation exercise. He blew a different sequence on the whistle, and the horses began moving in a pattern that gradually compressed the space available to the thieves. It wasn't an aggressive advance, but rather a methodical reduction of options that left Brennan and his men with an ever-shrinking area in which to maneuver. Cooper tried to push past Stella, the gray mare, but she shifted position to block his path without any visible signal from Thomas. When he attempted to move in a different direction, Copper the chestnut gelding was already there, cutting off his escape route with the timing of a perfectly executed military maneuver. "This ain't natural," Cooper whispered. "Horses don't act like this." "These horses do," Thomas replied calmly. "Because these horses have been taught that their survival and the survival of their herd depends on working together against common threats. In this case, gentlemen, you are the threat they've been trained to neutralize." Brennan raised his gun and aimed directly at Thunder, desperation making his voice high and tight. "I'll kill this stallion right now if you don't call them off. I swear I'll put a bullet in his brain." Thomas's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes grew cold as Arctic wind. "You could try that, son. But before you pull that trigger, let me tell you what happens next." He blew another whistle command, and Thunder immediately lowered his head and moved sideways, presenting a much smaller target while simultaneously positioning himself between Brennan's gun and the other horses. The movement was so fluid and practiced that it was clearly a response to a specific training drill. "First," Thomas continued in the same conversational tone, "you'd find that shooting a moving target in poor light is considerably more difficult than most men imagine. Second, the sound of gunfire would bring Sheriff Morrison and his posse charging through that door with considerably more force than they're currently planning to use. Third, and most importantly, threatening one of my horses crosses a line that 43 previous horse thieves learned was very dangerous to cross." Brennan's gun hand was shaking now, sweat running down his face despite the cool night air. His earlier confidence had completely crumbled, replaced by the desperate panic of a man who realized he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. "But it's the fourth consequence that should concern you most," Thomas said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Because if you harm one of these animals, you'll discover the difference between Thomas Blackwood, the stable hand, and Thomas Iron Creek, the marshal. And that, son, is a difference you really don't want to learn." Pike had backed against the stable wall, his hands raised in surrender. "Mr. Iron Creek, sir, I give up. I don't want no part of this anymore. Just tell me what you want me to do." Thomas nodded approvingly. "Smart choice, son. Move slowly toward that corner where Sheriff Morrison can see you clearly when he comes through that door. Keep your hands visible and don't make any sudden movements." Pike followed Thomas's instructions exactly, his relief evident as he positioned himself for peaceful surrender. "One down," Thomas noted quietly. Drummond was staring at the horses with the fascination of a man watching something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. "How do you train them to work together like that? It's like they can read each other's minds." "Horses are herd animals by nature," Thomas explained patiently. "They already want to work together for mutual protection. All I did was refine their natural instincts and give them specific responses to specific threats. These animals trust each other completely, and they trust me absolutely. That combination makes them more effective than most human military units." Cooper had stopped trying to find an escape route and was now simply standing motionless, overwhelmed by the hopelessness of his situation. The horses had created a living cage around the remaining thieves, and every attempt to break through their formation had been smoothly countered by coordinated responses that seemed to anticipate his movements before he made them. "I worked with wolf packs during my time in the Northern Territories," Thomas continued, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher explaining a complex subject to students. "Learned how predators coordinate their hunting strategies and how prey animals organize their defensive responses. Applied those lessons to horse training and developed methods that most cavalry officers still consider impossible." Brennan was now the only gang member still holding a weapon, and his desperation was making him increasingly dangerous. He swung the gun wildly between Thomas and the surrounding horses, looking for a target that might give him some leverage in negotiations that had already ended. "You can't hold us here forever, old man. Soon as the sun comes up, we'll find a way out. You ain't the only one who knows how to fight." Thomas checked his pocket watch in the matchlight. "Actually, son, it's been exactly 14 minutes since Sheriff Morrison arrived with his posse. In my experience, that's about how long it takes a competent peace officer to position his men around a building and prepare for a coordinated entry. I'd estimate you have approximately 30 seconds before this conversation becomes moot. As if summoned by Thomas's words, Sheriff Morrison's voice boomed through the night air with official authority. This is Sheriff Morrison. The building is completely surrounded. Anyone inside has 30 seconds to throw down their weapons and surrender peacefully. After that, we're coming in ready for trouble. Drummond and Cooper immediately raised their hands and began shouting their surrender to the men outside. Pike had already assumed a position that made his peaceful intentions clear to anyone who might enter the stable. That left Brennan alone with his gun, facing the calm certainty of a man who had never lost a confrontation with horse thieves and clearly had no intention of starting tonight. Last chance, Brennan, Thomas said quietly. You can surrender that weapon and walk out of here alive. Or you can choose the hard way and discover why 43 previous horse thieves decided cooperation was their best option. Brennan's face twisted with rage and frustration. He raised his gun toward Thomas one final time, his finger tightening on the trigger with the desperate fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. Thomas Iron Creek moved. The motion was so fast and fluid that the other thieves barely saw it happen. One moment Brennan was aiming his weapon, and the next moment he was on the ground with his gun hand pinned beneath Thomas's knee and his arm twisted at an angle that made resistance impossible. Pressure point techniques learned from Pinkerton agents, Thomas explained calmly as Brennan struggled futilely against the hold. Apply force to the correct nerve cluster, and even the strongest man becomes helpless without permanent injury. Sheriff Morrison and 3 deputies burst through the stable door just as Thomas was securing Brennan's hands with rope that appeared to have been cut from the same material used for the anti-theft knots. Evening, Sheriff Morrison, Thomas said, rising to his feet with the casual manner of a man discussing weather conditions. These gentlemen decided to test the security measures I've been developing. I'm pleased to report that the system performed exactly as designed. The sheriff stared at Thomas with obvious amazement. Thomas Iron Creek, as I live and breathe. Heard you were dead, shot down in Kansas. Just retired, Sheriff. Though I maintain my federal commission in case situations like this arise. These 4 men attempted to steal horses belonging to Miss Sarah Hartwell, and they're ready to be transported to Territorial holding for trial. Sheriff Morrison looked around the stable with the appreciation of a professional lawman observing masterful preparation. Heard stories about your methods for years, but seeing them in person is something else entirely. Those horses of yours are better trained than most human deputies. Thomas smiled and patted Thunder's neck affectionately. They're good partners, Sheriff. Always have been. Take care of them properly, and they'll take care of you when trouble arrives. As the prisoners were led away toward waiting transport, Thomas began the process of securing the stable for the remainder of the night. The horses returned to their stalls with the calm satisfaction of soldiers after a successful mission, and the complex security systems were reset for continued protection. The legendary horse whisperer Marshall had returned to duty one final time, and justice had been served with the precision and certainty that had made his reputation a warning to criminals across 3 territories. 3 days after the attempted theft, Thomas Blackwood returned to his morning routine with the same quiet efficiency he had maintained for 8 years. But the atmosphere around Millfield's stable had changed dramatically. Word of the night's events had spread through the territory with the speed that only extraordinary stories achieve, and Thomas found himself the object of a respect that made him slightly uncomfortable. Sarah Hartwell arrived earlier than usual that morning, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and wearing an expression that mixed gratitude with curiosity. She found Thomas checking Thunder's hooves for stones, his movements as gentle and methodical as ever despite the revelation of his true identity. I brought you some coffee, Sarah said, offering the cup with the deference now shown by everyone in town who had learned about Thomas Iron Creek. Thought you might appreciate something warm after what you've been through. Thomas accepted the coffee with a grateful nod, but his manner remained the same humble courtesy he had always shown. Much appreciated, Miss Sarah. Though I should mention that what happened the other night wasn't really an ordeal. More like a refresher course in skills I've been using for 30 years. Sarah settled herself on a wooden crate that served as makeshift seating near Thunder's stall. The stallion nuzzled her shoulder with obvious affection, demonstrating the same trust and gentleness he showed toward Thomas. She studied the old marshal's face, noting details she had never observed during his years of service as their stable hand. "Thomas," she said carefully, "I've been wondering about something since Sheriff Morrison told us who you really are. Why did you choose to work here as a stable hand when you could have had any position you wanted? Your reputation could have opened doors anywhere in the territory." Thomas continued his examination of Thunder's hoof, his attention focused on the task rather than the question. But when he spoke, his voice carried the reflective tone of a man who had thought deeply about the choices that had shaped his life. 23 years ago, Miss Sarah, I owned a horse ranch in Colorado Territory. Raised some of the finest cavalry mounts the Army ever used, and I was proud of every animal that carried my brand. Had a wife named Martha who loved those horses almost as much as I did, and we thought we'd found our place in the world. He set Thunder's hoof down gently and moved to the next one, his hands steady despite the emotion that flickered across his weathered face. Then the Kearney gang decided they wanted my horses more than I did. Came at night, just like Brennan's boys tried to do here. But I wasn't prepared the way I should have been. Sarah remained silent, sensing that Thomas was sharing a story he had rarely told, if ever. The stable grew quiet except for the soft sounds of horses moving in their stalls and the distant activity of the waking town. They got away with 37 horses, including my prize breeding stock, Thomas continued. Martha tried to stop them, and they shot her down like a dog in her own doorway. By the time I got back from checking the far pastures, my wife was dead and my life's work was gone. The coffee cup trembled slightly in Sarah's hands. "Thomas, I'm so sorry. I had no idea." Thomas straightened and looked at her with eyes that had learned to carry pain without being consumed by it. "That's when I became a federal marshal, Miss Sarah. Not for justice or duty or any of the noble reasons men usually claim. I became a lawman because I wanted to hunt down every horse thief in the territories and make sure no other family suffered what Martha and I went through." He moved to Kappa's stall and began the same careful examination, his voice taking on the measured cadence of a man recounting facts rather than memories. "Took me 6 months to track down the Kearney gang. Found them in a canyon hideout in New Mexico territory, still using my horses and still laughing about the old rancher whose wife tried to play hero." Sarah realized she was holding her breath, afraid to interrupt the story that explained so much about the man she had known only as a humble stable hand. "I gave them the same choice I gave Brennan's boys the other night," Thomas said quietly. "Surrender peacefully or face the consequences." The Kearney brothers chose differently than Brennan did. The implication hung in the stable air like morning mist, neither spoken nor denied. Thomas had found his wife's killers, and justice had been served according to the harsh mathematics of territorial law. "That was my first case as a federal marshal," Thomas continued, his voice returning to its normal conversational tone. "Spent the next 27 years hunting horse thieves and learning everything there was to know about preventing what happened to Martha from happening to anyone else." He finished examining Copper and moved to Stella's stall, where the gray mare welcomed him with the same trusting affection displayed by all the horses. But Sarah noticed that his hands paused for a moment on Stella's neck, as if drawing comfort from the connection. "Every technique I developed, every security measure I designed, every training method I perfected was about preventing other families from losing what Martha and I lost. The anti-theft knots, the coordinated horse responses, the stable security systems, all of it grew out of one night when I wasn't prepared for what evil men could do." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes, finally understanding the depth of knowledge and pain that had shaped the man she thought she knew. "No wonder you're so protective of these horses. They represent everything you fought to save." Thomas smiled, and for the first time since beginning his story, the expression held genuine warmth rather than the distant politeness he usually maintained. "These horses, Miss Sarah, they're living proof that preparation and dedication can prevent tragedy. Every night they sleep safely in their stalls represents a victory over men who think they can take what doesn't belong to them." He led Stella out to the paddock for her morning exercise, and Sarah followed, still processing the magnitude of what Thomas had revealed. As they walked, she noticed details about his movements and bearing that took on new significance given his background. Thomas moved with the unconscious authority of a man accustomed to command, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings with the automatic vigilance of someone trained to recognize potential threats. Even in retirement, Even performing the humble tasks of a stable hand, he remained Marshal Thomas Iron Creek. "Can I ask you something else?" Sarah said as they reached the paddock fence. "Why did you choose our town? With your reputation, you could have settled anywhere." Thomas leaned against the fence and watched Stella explore the paddock with the contented movements of a horse that knew she was safe and valued. He was silent for so long that Sarah wondered if he had heard the question. "When I decided to retire from active service," Thomas finally said, "I spent 2 years traveling through territories where I'd worked, visiting places where I'd captured horse thieves and protected people's livelihoods. I wanted to find a town that needed protection but didn't have adequate resources to provide it." He gestured toward the stable and the surrounding countryside with obvious affection. Millfield was perfect. Good people, valuable horses, and a location that made it attractive to the kind of men I'd spent my career hunting. I knew that sooner or later, horse thieves would come calling, and when they did, I wanted to be ready. "So you've been planning for something like the other night for 8 years. Thomas nodded. "Every day, Miss Sarah. Every time I checked those knots, every time I drilled the horses in their response patterns, every time I tested the security systems, I was preparing for men like Brennan who think taking other people's property is easier than earning their own living." A month later, the transformation of Thomas's reputation was complete. What had begun as whispered stories about the legendary horse whisperer Marshall had evolved into documented fact that spread through law enforcement circles across 3 territories. Sheriff Morrison had filed official reports that attracted attention from federal marshals, territorial governors, and cavalry commanders who remembered Thomas's contributions during his active career. But the most significant change was in Thomas himself. The stooped posture and deferential manner of Thomas Blackwood, the stable hand, had been permanently replaced by the quiet authority of Thomas Iron Creek, the marshal. He no longer pretended to be anything other than what he was, and the community of Millfield had embraced his true identity with gratitude and pride. Young men from surrounding ranches began arriving at the stable on weekends, seeking instruction in the horse security techniques that had become legendary throughout the territory. Thomas welcomed these students with the patience of a teacher who understood that knowledge shared was knowledge preserved. "The anti-theft knots take practice to master properly," Thomas explained to a group of 6 ranch hands who had ridden 30 miles to learn his methods. "The rope has to be treated with specific oils to achieve the right texture, and the tension must be adjusted according to the individual horse's strength and temperament." He demonstrated the complex weaving pattern with the slow precision of a master craftsman, his weathered fingers moving through the intricate loops and turns with unconscious expertise. Each student attempted to replicate the knot, and Thomas patiently corrected their errors with the understanding of someone who had once struggled to learn the same techniques. "Remember," Thomas said as he watched their efforts, "these knots aren't meant to hurt the horses or prevent them from moving naturally. They're designed to defeat rapid cutting attempts by men who don't understand the rope structure. A patient man with sufficient knowledge can untie them in seconds, but a thief working in darkness and haste will only make them tighter." One of the students, a young man named Billy Morrison who was Sheriff Morrison's nephew, raised his hand with a question. "Marshal Iron Creek, how do you train the horses to work together the way yours do? My father's horses barely tolerate each other, much less cooperate in defense." Thomas smiled at the question, recognizing the eagerness of someone who genuinely wanted to learn rather than simply acquire bragging rights about studying with a legend. "Horse coordination begins with establishing trust within the herd, Billy. Horses are naturally social animals, but most domestic horses never develop the defensive instincts that wild herds use for survival." He led the group to the paddock where Thunder, Copper, Stella, and the other horses grazed peacefully together. But when Thomas whistled a specific sequence, the horses immediately formed the same defensive formation they had used against Brennan's gang. "Start with basic commands that every horse learns individually," Thomas continued as the horses demonstrated their training. "But practice those commands with multiple horses present, so they learn to respond as a group rather than as individuals. Add complexity gradually, always rewarding cooperation and patience." The students watched in amazement as Thomas guided the horses through increasingly complex maneuvers using only whistle commands and subtle hand gestures. The animals moved with the coordination of a precision military unit, each horse anticipating the other's movements and responding to threats with unified purpose. How long did it take to train them to this level? Another student asked. Thomas considered the question carefully. Basic coordination took about 6 months of daily practice. Advanced defensive maneuvers required another 2 years of refinement. But the foundation of trust that makes everything else possible, that takes a lifetime of consistent, honest interaction. Word of Thomas's training sessions spread even further than stories of his confrontation with the horse thieves. Within 3 months, he was receiving official requests from cavalry units, territorial law enforcement agencies, and ranch associations for instruction in his methods. But Thomas politely declined most of these invitations, preferring to focus on local students who would protect the region he had chosen as home. The horses seemed happy with their new fame, Sarah observed one evening as she and Thomas watched the animals graze in the paddock. They carry themselves differently now, like they know there's something special. Thomas leaned against the fence post, his expression peaceful in the golden light of another day's ending. They always were something special, Miss Sarah. They just needed an opportunity to prove it. Same as most creatures, I suppose. Sarah had grown comfortable with these evening conversations, enjoying the rare glimpses into Thomas's thoughts and philosophy that he shared when the day's work was finished and the stable was quiet. Do you ever miss it? She asked. The excitement of hunting criminals and solving cases that nobody else could handle. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching Thunder and Stella nuzzle each other with the contentment of horses that knew they were protected and valued. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the satisfaction of a man who had found peace with his choices. I spent 30 years preventing tragedies, Miss Sarah. But prevention is invisible success. Nobody celebrates the crimes that don't happen or the families that don't suffer because a thief was caught before he could strike. The real victory isn't capturing criminals after they've caused harm. The real victory is creating systems that make their crimes impossible to commit. He gestured toward the stable and its sophisticated security measures, then toward the horses that had been trained to defend themselves and each other. Everything you see here represents prevention rather than reaction. These horses will never be stolen. This community will never suffer what Martha and I suffered, and young men from surrounding ranches are learning techniques that will protect their families for generations. Sarah followed his gaze, seeing the stable and its occupants with new understanding. You're not really retired at all, are you? You're still a marshal, just working a different kind of case. Thomas smiled, and the expression held the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found his true purpose. The best kind of case, Miss Sarah. The kind where everybody wins except the criminals, and the criminals never get close enough to cause any real harm. As autumn settled over the territory, Thomas established a routine that balanced his stable duties with his growing reputation as the premier authority on horse security. Students continued to arrive for training, law enforcement officials consulted him on difficult cases, and his methods were officially adopted by cavalry units throughout the Western Territories. But the greatest testament to his success was the gradual disappearance of horse theft from the entire region surrounding Millfield. Word had spread through criminal networks that the territory was protected by the legendary horse Whisperer Marshal and his impossibly well-trained horses. Professional thieves chose easier targets, and amateur criminals found other pursuits that didn't carry the risk of confronting Thomas Iron Creek. On the first anniversary of Brennan's failed robbery attempt, Thomas stood in the stable doorway at sunset, watching his horses settle into their stalls for another peaceful night. The same routine he had followed for 9 years continued unchanged, but everything about its meaning had been transformed. Sheriff Morrison appeared at his shoulder, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of a lawman whose territory had become notably more peaceful over the past year. Thought you might enjoy some company for the evening watch, Morrison said, offering one of the cups. Been a quiet year since word got out about your methods. Haven't had a single reported horse theft in 6 counties. Thomas accepted the coffee gratefully, noting that Morrison no longer showed the deference that had marked their interactions immediately after the revelation of his identity. They had settled into the comfortable relationship of professional equals who respected each other's expertise. Quiet is good, Thomas replied, sipping the coffee and enjoying its warmth against the cooling evening air. Quiet means families sleeping peacefully and honest men keeping their property. Morrison leaned against the doorframe, studying the horses with the appreciation of someone who had learned to recognize exceptional training. Your students are doing well. Young Billy Morrison has set up security systems at 3 neighboring ranches, and the Hendersons hired 2 of your other graduates to protect their breeding stock. Thomas nodded with satisfaction. Knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied, Sheriff. Every man who learns these techniques properly can teach others, and every horse protected represents a victory over the men who would steal them. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade behind the mountains and listening to the peaceful sounds of horses settling into sleep. It was the sound Thomas had worked 30 years to preserve, and it never failed to bring him contentment. As Sheriff Morrison prepared to leave for his evening rounds, he turned back with a question that had obviously been on his mind for some time. Thomas, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd been able to prevent what happened to Martha and your ranch all those years ago? Thomas considered the question with the same careful thought he brought to all discussions of his past. Every day, Sheriff. But I've learned that wondering about alternate histories is less productive than working to prevent future tragedies. Martha's memory is honored every time a family keeps their horses safe because of techniques I developed after losing her. Morrison nodded understanding and touched the brim of his hat in farewell. Evening, Marshal. Sleep well. Thomas remained in the doorway long after Morrison's footsteps had faded into the distance. The stable was completely quiet now except for the soft breathing of sleeping horses and the occasional rustle of straw as an animal shifted position. Tomorrow would bring another day of the same routine that had sustained him through 9 years of hiding and 1 year of renewed purpose. He would check each horse for injury or illness, maintain the security systems that protected them, and continue training young men who would carry his methods into the future. But tonight, as every night since Brennan's failed robbery, Thomas Iron Creek stood watch over horses that would never be stolen and families that would never suffer the loss that had defined his life's work. The legendary horse whisperer Marshall had found his perfect case, the kind where victory was measured not in criminals captured but in crimes prevented, not in justice served but in peace preserved. And in the quiet darkness of a stable where horses slept safely under the protection of systems designed by a man who had learned too late how precious such safety could be, Thomas finally allowed himself the satisfaction of work completed and purpose fulfilled. If this tale of hidden strength and unwavering protection has touched you tonight, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that celebrate the quiet heroes who stand guard while others sleep. We bring you tales of courage, dedication, and the extraordinary people who choose to protect rather than profit, to prevent rather than punish. Until next time, may you find the peace that comes from knowing someone stands watch, and may you have the courage to stand watch for others when your time comes.